Yeah, today we want to speak about the book of Job. We've had 52 radio broadcasts on the book of Job, and we're following the outline of those 52 radio broadcasts in this course on the book of Job. The first 10 lessons are introductory, and the first one is on authorship. The second one is on location, and the third one is on the outline of Job. And then we talk about the connection between Solomon and Job in lesson 4, or the fourth broadcast, and then the source of revelation where they got their thoughts from, lesson 5, and the grace perspective in lesson 6, then what we call the law of equalization, and then the personal faith of Job, and then in the introductory yet we discuss the two wild animals, the behemoth and the leviathan. Then after that we take up the chapters individually. So since there are 42 chapters, you see that covers then the 52 lessons, one for each week in a year. And this is the outline that we're working with in this course on the book of Job. Now, when we think of authorship, we think of three authors really in the book of Job. Now, there's all sorts of ideas among different commentators and scholars for centuries as to who the authors of Job are. They are thinking that maybe it's late. Some believe that Moses wrote Job. Of course, many believe that Solomon did altogether, almost. And others put it after Daniel and Ezra because of what they think are Aramaisms in the book of Job. I had a problem when I first began with the book of Job because I knew Solomon had a hand in it. There's such a close connection between the words that you find in Job and the words you find in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes especially. And I couldn't quite figure out how Solomon, who according to 1 Kings 4 is considered to be the wisest man that ever lived, how he could get all of his style out of Job. I didn't think that was possible, and then he still be such a wise person. So I sort of followed the position that Dr. Martin Luther followed, that Solomon took material that he had from Job and then went ahead and added the drama, the poetry. It's very difficult poetry, very close-knit drama, and put it in the form that we have today, because most of the book is poetry. Actually, the prose section consists only of the first 2 chapters and the third chapter, and the last chapter, and then the first 6 verses of chapter 32, introducing the 4 speeches of the young man Elihu. But after I've worked through it now for over 3 years carefully, I find quotations from Job already in Moses, in Deuteronomy 32 and 24. And then I find quite a few quotations from Job in the Psalms. And this makes me realize there was something there before. And then I began to realize that these men were not primitive in any way. There are always those who claim that people 4,000 years ago had to be primitive, didn't have the intelligence that we have today because of the evolutionary theory. I realized that these men were smarter than almost anybody. They actually, I was convinced, carried on their conversation in the most difficult Hebrew poetry imaginable. And we couldn't do that today, or I don't know of hardly anyone today that does that. And so I finally became convinced that Solomon showed how wise he was by knowing where to get wisdom, and that he actually got his whole style out of Job. And that what we have in Job is the way it was originally, except for the prologue and the epilogue and the introduction to chapter 32, which I think Solomon did add. These are so formal that it's hard to imagine Job writing them even 100 years after his experiences and be that matter of fact and that unemotional as you see in these first two chapters and maybe even in the last chapter. So my conviction now is that there are three authors to the book of Job. First of all, Job wrote himself from chapter 33 to 31. That includes the dialogue and his witnessing to his friends, and it includes also statements he makes on how happy he was before his experience, how much he suffered through his experience, and how righteous he was. Then I'm also convinced that Elihu wrote chapters 32 to 41, including the whirlwind talks. Elihu showed a great deal of capability and brilliance. He could quote almost exactly from what the friends in Job said, and I doubt whether he had it written down. It was just pure memory, exact memory, in fact. And Elihu also claimed he had a vision from the Lord, which would be a source of revelation. And Elihu also claimed that he was perfect and was God's representative for Job. And that would indicate that Elihu was one of the inspired writers of the Bible, and that he did write this section. And then I think Solomon took this source material and added the prologue and the epilogue and the introduction to Elihu's speech. And this is how we have the book of Job today. It'd be nice possibly to consider that all one author wrote it, but inspiration doesn't necessarily demand that. Inspiration allows for the use of sources. And so I believe, therefore, that we can say Solomon is maybe chiefly responsible to us today for the inspiration of the book because he put it in the final form that we have it today. Yet primarily, he didn't write the book. Primarily, Job and Elihu wrote the book. And that may seem a little strange, but it does make for better understanding of the book of Job. And the concept that many have that things had to be primitive back there is really not true. We have done a lot of work with anthropology, and of course as we bring the Bible and the science of anthropology together, we tend to turn it around. And whereas people think that man started in Africa because they want him coming from chimpanzees, more or less, and there's supposed to be more chimpanzees in Africa. Actually, man began in the Middle East, as the Bible points out. Then again, where people think that man developed gradually upward from animals, the Bible says that when Adam was made, he named all the animals the first day he was alive, so he was never a ape or whatever. He was far more intelligent than we are today, because I don't know of a scientist today that can name all the animals. Therefore, when the anthropologists today say that the Neanderthal men are maybe 100 to 200,000 years old, or maybe the Cro-Magnon men are 35,000 years old, and sort of try to make them primitive and not intelligent, we turn that around quite a bit. We believe that they were more intelligent because as they find fossils of these characters, they find that the brain is greater in size than ours today. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean intelligence, but it's often construed as meaning intelligence, especially by the evolutionists. Now, as we look into it from a scriptural viewpoint, we tend to believe that the Neanderthal men were the people who lived before and after the flood, and they were bigger and probably had bigger brains, and they certainly were very intelligent. And then we think that there was an in-between period between the time when the big dinosaurs lived, maybe before and after the flood, and the time when the weather got worse and people didn't live as long, and then we had mammoths and mastodons instead of the big dinosaurs, whereas now we have elephants which are even smaller than mammoths and mastodons. And as we note that the Cro-Magnon people made drawings of mammoths and mastodons on their cave walls, we are convinced that the Cro-Magnon people lived about the time of Job. And as we see the tremendous intelligence that's demonstrated in the dialogue and in the way they use poetry and spoken poetry, tremendous insight that everybody had, we can see that these could be Cro-Magnon people with more intelligence than what we have today, and from whom we can learn a great deal. Another thing that's interesting in the book of Job is that there's hardly anything missing. There's always a great deal of theology, a great deal of science. The picture of science in Job 28, where he describes the diligent way that miners looked for gold and silver and copper and iron and all the precious pearls, shows that they were just as diligent in their using and searching into nature then as they are now. And so we find really rather tremendous science also in those days and in the book of Job. And so therefore we tend to think that we have three authors in the book of Job. Job himself and Elihu and Solomon. And this gives us a kind of a living concept then of the book of Job. Now we want to go on to the second lesson. As I say, we have 52 lessons that we are using to discuss the book of Job, 10 introductory and 42 covering each individual chapter. And so we're on the second lesson called Location and Time. Now, of course, it says in the book of Job that Job lived in the land of Uz. And if you look in Job, you'll find a Jobab mentioned in Genesis 10, and then you'll find a Jobab mentioned in Genesis 36. And there are many people who believe that Job is one of these Jobabs that are mentioned in these either one of these two chapters. The Jobab in Genesis 10 is about 4 generations after the flood, about the time of Peleg. We kind of believe that's a little bit early for Job for many reasons. We believe Job was closer to Abraham than that. Abraham lived about 2050 BC, whereas the flood was about 2345 BC before Christ. And so that allows about 300 years after the flood for Abraham to live. We also believe that the Jobab in Genesis 36 is a little bit late. This is one of the descendants of Esau, one of the kings maybe 4 generations down from Esau. And Esau, of course, was a descendant of Isaac and then of Abraham. And we think that's far too late. So we like to put Job then around 50 years before Abraham, and that would make it either 2050 or maybe even more likely 2100 BC. Maybe Job was a contemporary of Terah. Then, of course, as you look into the commentaries, you discover that they have all kinds of ideas as to when Job lived. They feel they find Aramaisms in Job, and therefore they believe that Job must have been written late, maybe after the time of Daniel or Ezra, because you find Aramaisms in Daniel and in Ezra. But we've discovered lately that these may not be Aramaisms. There's a new scholarship developing today that talks about a Ugaritic language, and that came out of a town in Syria. And this goes way, way back. And so these may not be Aramaisms at all. They may be Ugaritic influence. There is much Egyptian influence in the book of Job. You can see that in many different ways. It talks of one of the swiftest things around is a boat going swiftly through the waters, reminds you of Egypt. Then there's much of an Arab background too. And one of the leading commentators on the book of Job, a man by the name of Franz Delitzsch, has depended heavily in his commentary on a man by the name of Wettstein, who studied the Arab influence very carefully and is quite an authority on it. And there's clearly a great deal of Bedouin and Arab influence in the book of Job. But we don't find any of that Aramaic influence that some think they find there, rather Ugaritic influence. So we believe that there isn't any necessity of putting Job way late, as some commentators do, but rather it seems to fit in best before Abraham. There's no reference to Abraham. There's no reference to Moses or the giving of the law or to Isaac or to Jacob. And these are some of the more distinctive Jewish things. In fact, we might even say the book of Job is not a Jewish book. Now, the Jews, of course, claim it. They have it in their Jewish Bible, which is our Old Testament. But yet it really doesn't relate to Abraham or to Isaac or to Jacob or to Moses. It's before that time, clearly. And that's why we like to put it about 50 years before Abraham. Now, we don't know exactly where the location of Uz is. Some put it pretty far east in plains on the other side of Jordan. We think it's in southern Syria, about where we have H-A-U-R-A-N, Hauran today. In fact, Job's house is still shown in the village of Hauran. People don't go there very often. It's in Syria. It's more difficult to get into Syria after you've been into Israel or vice versa. And yet that's where Job's house has been shown. This is just east of Mount Hermon, and it's on a basaltic plain, and it's a very rich soil. The area around Haran is still the granary of that whole part of the world today. It was my privilege in 1984 to have a tour of Israel, and we were having a convention also. And then our guide took us, as we toured the country, our guide took us to the Golden Heights first, and then beyond the Golden Heights to the Syrian border. And then when we got to the Syrian border, we could see how rich this country was, how nutritious it was in its soil. You can note that even as you were in the upper part of the Jordan River Valley. And then the guide pointed out that the volcanic soil that's there in this area beyond the Golden Heights is so rich in nutrients that the Israelites use it as fertilizer without even processing it, just put it on the land as it is. And if it's that nutrient today, you can imagine how much more it was 4,000 years ago, shortly after, maybe 200-300 years after it had erupted. And so that's an ideal place for Job to be in, for the land of Uz to be, because the soil is so rich. Now, one of the problems we have with the book of Job is just how much does it refer to catastrophe? Many of us believe there are three major worldwide catastrophes that help shape our geography and our geology that we have in the world today. One would be the third day of creation, when God seemingly raised the mountains and dropped the valleys to separate water and land. And that is based on a reference in Psalm 104. And then the second major worldwide catastrophe would be the flood in the days of Noah. And of course, that's the major one, and many people try to get everything into that one catastrophe, and it possibly could be done, because it's a very significant worldwide catastrophe. And then the third one that some are suggesting is one that seems to be indicated by Genesis 10:25, when it says that in the days of Peleg the earth was divided by a stream division, or a Peleg division. Peleg in the Hebrew means a stream. That would hardly be a language division. It must be some kind of a geographical division, since it's based on stream. And also we find that in the life of Peleg, his father lived 469 years or so, and then he only lived 239. So there was a drop of 200 years in age level in one generation, and that wouldn't be normal. You could see a gradual drop, but not that rapid, unless there was some real catastrophe around. And so there are many who believe that maybe the continents split in those days, that right after the flood, the people were supposed to go over the whole world and subdue it, and they didn't want to, so instead they congregated on the plains of Mesopotamia and built the Tower of Babel to heaven, and then God separated them by dividing their languages and forced them to go all over the world. Then after he'd done that, then he enforced it even more by having the continents separate, and these people were on the continents as they moved, and in that way it was even more dramatic for them that they'd have to subdue the whole earth. Of course, the idea as to whether there was a third catastrophe is not conclusive. There's many people who question it. And those who believe in it tend to think that they can find references to this catastrophe in Job. There's quite a few references, for instance, to snow and ice. And there's references to mountains being overturned. And normally, even with earthquakes and volcanoes today, mountains aren't usually overturned. And other references to catastrophe. So the question is, do these references indicate such a worldwide catastrophe? I'm sure they could. But we find also that when we say this is the location where Job lived, at Haran and maybe 50, 60 miles east of Mount Hermon, a lot of these references can be explained just from the location. There was a great volcano eruption there, at least during the flood, maybe on the third day of creation, maybe in the days of Peleg. And Mount Hermon, of course, has snow and ice in the winter. And so if people live close to Mount Hermon, they would be familiar with snow and ice, although normally Palestine is not familiar with snow and ice. It's more like Florida or Southern California, in that kind of a climate. So this is the reason that we tend to fix our sights on this location of Haran, the traditional location, 50, 60 miles east of Mount Hermon, with Mount Hermon always in the foreground, and this is where Job seemingly lived. A rather ideal place to live, a rich soil, yet not a barren desert, a lot of mountains, a lot of variety, a lot of things that would make people, energetic in that kind of climate. So that's what we'd like to think of. And then, as we pointed out in the first lesson, they were very advanced in their culture. Job had 7,000 sheep and goats. He had 3,000 camels. He had 500 yoke of oxen. Then he had 500 donkeys or she-asses. And he had a great number of servants. He would have been he was the greatest man of the East. God says of him that he was perfect. I don't know that God ever says that of anybody else in the Bible. He says, first of all, Solomon said it in the very first verse, and then when God talked to Job, to the devil, Satan, those two times in chapter 1 and chapter 2, he says, look at my servant Job, who is perfect, who is righteous, and who fights evil. So Job was a really great man. I'm sure Job could have been a major world power at that time. But Job was such a Christian that he didn't want to use force. He points that out when he describes his righteousness in Job chapter 31. He says he renounces that. He knows the superior power of love, and he wants to concentrate on love and being helpful to the widows and the poor and the orphans and the fatherless, and he does, and he takes care of them. He points that out very carefully. He even goes so far that he takes care of the land. The last verses of Job 31 shows that he gives the land rest, and in those days hardly anybody worried about ecology because they didn't realize the need of it that much yet. Everything was, you know, pretty much as God had made it. So Job is undoubtedly a great man, you know, a really great man, and a really great righteousness. I would say his righteousness might exceed that of anybody else in the Bible except maybe Christ himself. So here was a great man, probably living in a tent. The Bedouins usually lived in a tent. And then he'd go to the village, and he was the judge and the ruler, and he'd go in the gate and he'd hold court. But he didn't go beyond that. He didn't try to be a world power. He didn't want to use force. So this gives you an idea of when Job lived and where he lived and the background. And that was helpful in a better understanding of the book of Job. Now we want to go on to the third of the 52 lessons that we have in the book of Job. This one is on the outline of Job. And the outline to us is quite significant. When I was a student at the seminary in St. Louis, Concordia Seminary, we had an instructor who opened my eye to what is really the heart of the book of Job. It was Dr. Letch, L-A-E-T-S-C-H. He pointed out that where most people think the heart of the book of Job is in Job 19:25, when Job says, I know my Redeemer lives, and though my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I will see God, and mine eye shall behold and not another. He pointed out that the real heart of the book is in Job chapter 33, verses 23 to 25, where Elihu leads Job deeper into the gospel. See, Job knew the gospel all right. He mentions the pardoner in Job 7, the advocate in Job 9. He mentions salvation in Job 13. He mentions the Redeemer in Job 19. He was different that way with his friends. They didn't know the gospel, and because they didn't, and he finally realized that as a result of the dialogue with them, he went ahead and witnessed to them in Job 27:28, trying to bring them to the gospel. And the Lord finally did bring them to the gospel when the Lord told Job in the last chapter to pray and sacrifice for his friends. But Elihu knew the gospel, but he realized that Job, who was accusing God of injustice, although he knew the gospel, at this point didn't know it well enough. And so then he led Job deeper into the gospel. In that expression, there would be an angel above 1,000, a messenger above 1,000 who would ransom Job's soul from a pit, and then make his flesh as fresh as that of a little baby. And that really did happen then. His flesh became as fresh as that of a little baby because he lived another 140 years. So you can see that this is the heart of the book of Job, and it shows that the power of love is superior to any other power. And so that's what we want to concentrate on as we think of the outline. Now, when we think of the outline, it's not really too difficult. I'm surprised how little people know Job. For example, when you have Christmas programs, you have a reference to Isaiah and the branch, or Isaiah maybe and the servant of the Lord. You might have a reference to Malachi and how Malachi says that John the Baptist would be the forerunner for Jesus. And you have a reference maybe to Psalm 8, which is a Christmas psalm. But how often in a Christmas program has anybody referred to Job, where you have references to Jesus as a redeemer, as a partner, as an advocate, as a savior, where you have the living wild animals that led Job deeper into the gospel, into repentance, and into greater trust on Jesus. You have the angel above 1,000. You have the flesh of Job becoming as fresh as a little child because of what Christ was doing to him 2,000 years before Christ came. And so you see, people really don't know Job very well. It's a difficult book, of course. It's very difficult language, very difficult poetry. Luther tore his hair out and he says, I never found anything so hard to translate in all the Bible as the book of Job is to translate. And I suppose it's one reason why people don't really know this book too well. But really the outline isn't very difficult, and it helps to know the book and to work with it to know the outline. First we have the prologue, chapter 1 and 2, written by Solomon, who points out that Job was perfect and had this fine family and all this wealth and was the greatest man of the East. Then we have something you don't find very often in the Bible. You have a picture of the devil challenging God right in heaven, seemingly, when the sons of God are together. And that's done twice. In both places, God challenges Job. Challenges the devil. The devil finally is given permission the first time to take all the material blessings away from Job, including his children, and the second time to put the worst possible disease on him. And then after that, Job is still quite righteous. He doesn't renounce his faith. He censures his wife who wanted him to curse God and die because the devil thought he would do that. But then when the friends came, things changed. Then Job wasn't so righteous anymore. Then he accused God of injustice. I think he lost face with his friends. We see that happening in the Orient quite a bit today, where ancestor worship is so strong and where people want to not embarrass their ancestors, so they always keep a front, a face. And I think Job lost that when he saw his friends came, and that probably caused him to depart from God. Then we have the dialogue, chapters 3 to 26, and it's in a form of what we call an argument or a syllogism, a major and minor premise and then a conclusion. The major premise that the friends make, led by Eliphaz and then supported by Bildad and Zophar, is that God punishes sinners. That's the major premise. And then the minor premise they make is that Job has been specially punished, and so their conclusion is he must have committed some unusual sin. And since they couldn't find any sin, they said it must be a secret sin. And they insisted on that. And then Job, of course, defends himself all the way through because he knew he was righteous in Christ, and therefore he insists on his innocence. And this is difficult for the friends to understand because they don't know Christ, and they don't see anybody can claim to be innocent. See, we can't be innocent except through Christ. Then after the dialogue, Job refuted them quite effectively, particularly by showing that the righteous aren't always blessed in this life and the wicked aren't always punished in this life, as they claimed. Then he goes ahead and witnesses to his friends. The 27th, 28th chapter are very difficult for many people because, Zophar doesn't even make the conclusion. He finally realizes they've lost their cause. And they can't figure out why Job would say in chapter 21 and 24 that the wicked are not punished, and then in 27 say they are. It looks like he's contradicting himself. So they claim, oh, that's just Zophar, and it got mixed up. But you see what Job is doing in 27, he's showing his friends their sins. The wickedness that he speaks of is different. The wickedness he speaks of in chapter 24 is the wickedness the world recognizes, that of a murderer, a thief, an adulterer, an oppressor. But the wickedness of 27 is hypocrisy. The friends thought they were righteous, and really because they didn't have the gospel, they were as wicked as any murderer. And that's what he's pointing out. So you see, it's a different kind of wickedness. He's trying to take away that mask of self-righteousness that they had and show them their sins. And then the 28th chapter, he brings the gospel to them in a very unique way by showing that no matter how diligent we are with nature, no matter how scientific we are, we'll never find real science, real wisdom, until we have the miracle of the gospel fear of God. See, he says again and again that you can never find real wisdom in nature. Even though nature gives you a lot of wisdom, it doesn't give you the real wisdom because that depends on the gospel fear of God. And that way he brought his friends witness to them at least about the gospel. Then after that, you have the 4 speeches of Elihu. By this time, Elihu, the young man who had kept quiet because he respected age, realized they were all wrong. And then he insists that he has a vision from the Lord too. Eliphaz said he had a vision from the Lord. Well, it's probably a seance, because since he didn't know the gospel, it clearly wasn't from the Lord. But Elihu's vision is altogether different in chapter 33, and it's clearly from the Lord. And Elihu also claims that he's perfect, that he's God's representative to Job, that he's inspired by God, and that's why I think he wrote this section of Job originally. And Elihu then leads Job deeper into the gospel, and that's then the real heart of the book, as my professor, Dr. Letch, pointed out to me already back in 1936 and 37, when I took a course with him on the book of Job. And then he speaks about the angel above 1,000 that would redeem his soul from a pit, make his flesh as fresh as that of a little child. And then Elihu does something very unusual. He censures Job, but in deep love. Now, Job was on the dung heap, and his skin was all black. His bones stuck out, and he had all kinds of boils, and he had leprosy and cancer, and it was definitely terminal. He knew he was going to die from all human observation. And yet Elihu treated him as if he was a king on a throne, just like Nathan, for instance, spoke to David after David committed the sin with Bathsheba. He had to be very careful, or David would have killed him on the spot, you see. And so that's the way Elihu treated Job. And Job respected that love. Job, lived for love. And when he saw that tremendous love that Elihu was showing, he respected it. He always said to his friends, "You're miserable comforters. You're not showing love. You're just condemning me, you see." Then Elihu could censure him, and Job listened. He didn't argue with. And then Elihu had 4 speeches, 3 of which were censuring speeches. In fact, Elihu went so far in the 36th chapter that he said, even finally, a great ransom won't save you if you don't repent of this, which means he practically accused him of the sin against the Holy Ghost. That's how serious his accusations against God really were. And Job listened. Then after he got through, then God talked in the whirlwind talk. Now, I had quite a problem with the whirlwind talk, because I knew that love is the greatest thing in God, not his sovereignty, but his love is the greatest thing in God. And I knew that the height of love here in the book is in the 33rd chapter. Now, and then I could see why after Elihu had calmed Job down, that then he censured him. But now, the whirlwind talk doesn't speak directly much of love. It points out to Job, first of all, where were you when I did all these inorganic things that don't have life in them, made the stars and the sky and the weather and the foundation of the earth and all of that? But then God goes on in the whirlwind talk and speaks of 11 wild animals, the lioness and her cub, and the raven, and the wild ass, and the wild goat, and the wild bull, and then the stupid ostrich, and then the wild war horse, and then the eagle, and the hawk, and the behemoth, and the leviathan. Well, I puzzled over this. I used to think first that maybe all God was doing was showing the infinity of his attributes, the omnis, like omnipotent means all-powerful, omniscient means all-wise, and omnipresent means he's everywhere, all-loving. And that really he just was showing the infinity of all of his attributes, including that of love. But then I got to working with a stupid ostrich. And the stupid ostrich tries to be like a gentle swan and can't. God made it wild, and it can never be a gentle swan. It's got a wild nature born into it. Many scientists have censored this picture of the ostrich, but it always checks out, nevertheless as being accurate. Sometimes the ostrich is pretty good, but it isn't always that wild, but essentially it's still impetuous and stupid. Then I began to realize this was really God picturing Job. Job couldn't change his nature. Job was accusing God of injustice on his own. He could never get away from that. He'd have to have the miracle of the gospel totally regenerate him before he could get away from the way in which he was accusing God of injustice. Then I began to understand what all the other animals meant. You could never change the nature of a lioness and her cub. It was voracious, and at this time Job, instead of being loved, was voracious with God. He was eating God up with accusations. Then you could see he was like voracious like a raven. Then you could see he was wild like a wild ass, a wild goat, or a wild bullock, not a unicorn, but a wild bull. And Job knew that. Job knew that you can't take a wild ass and make it a tame ass that he had, or a wild goat and make it a tame goat as he had tame goats, or a wild bull and make a tame bull as he had those 500 yoke of oxen before they'd been destroyed. And then, of course, also the same with the war horse and the eagle and the hawk, and especially with the two big animals, the behemoth and the leviathan, the two dinosaurs of those days, the big brachiosaurus and the plesiosaurus. Especially when it speaks of the leviathan breathing out fire and smoke and nobody ever be able to capture. That's why Job, the enemies couldn't defeat him. He defeated them easily. But you see, his nature had to be changed. He was following his sinful nature too much, even though he knew the gospel. And that really quieted Job down. About that time, when I learned about this, I was talking to a Dr. John Look. I got in touch with him because I'd heard that he was a missionary in the rainforest of the Congo, and that he knew about the live dinosaurs that seemingly were supposed to still be there yet today. So he had me come over. Well, I first talked to him on the phone, and I told him what I had learned about the animals. He says, that's interesting. He says, when I was a dentist missionary in the Marxist Congo in this rainforest, I would go by a canoe. It would take me all day to make 7 miles, cut through the jungle. And I would serve the people on their island. See, most of them was 8 feet of water, and then they lived on islands. And then I would try to witness to them about the gospel after I'd helped them, with their teeth. And he says the interesting thing was I could never reach them with logic. But if I told an animal story, like these animal stories here in the book of Job, they caught on right away. And I could really reach them. Well, I'm sure Job caught on right away. The commentaries hardly ever have. I know of only one commentary probably that really understands the meaning of the 11 wild animals. And so you see, what God is really doing, Elihu had brought the deep love to Job, and now God is showing Job his sins to get him to repent, and comparing him to these wild animals. And it was the most effective way that he could witness to Job. Job caught on quicker that way than he would have any other way. See, God knew Job better than Job knew himself. And Job repented. First, he put his hand in the mouth and said he was wicked, but that wasn't enough. He hadn't repented yet. Then God brought in the behemoth and the leviathan, the two big ones. That really made him see how bad he was. And then he fully repented in dust and ashes. And then God told him to pray and sacrifice for his friends and show that love, because by this time they weren't friends anymore. They'd become enemies. And so God wanted him to show love to his enemies, which he did. And at that point then, when he did that, showing again the superior power of love, God gave him twice all the blessings he had previously. Instead of 7,000 sheep and goats, he had 14,000. Instead of 3,000 camels, he had 6,000. And instead of 500 yoke of oxen, he had 1,000. Instead of 500 donkeys, he had 1,000. And of course, a whole new family again of 7 sons and 3 daughters that were brought to him. And he lived twice as long, 140 years longer. His flesh did become as fresh as a little baby to permit him to live that 140 years yet after this. So he died probably when he was 210. So this is the outline of the book of the Job, and the reason we're interested in it is twofold. One is so that people get a little more familiarity with this book and know how to use it a little more, have a little more of a grasp of it, know what's going on in the book, and then furthermore, to show that the real heart of the book is here in Job 33, 23, 25, and that what's so important is that we learn to make love the great thing in our life. It's the great power, not force, but love is the great power. Love and teaching and education will do more than force any time in the long run. And that's one of the great lessons out of Job, and that we get particularly out of the outline of Job. Today, now we want to consider the fourth lesson of 52 lessons based on 52 broadcasts on the book of Job. This one relates Solomon to the book of Job more intimately. We have already indicated that we believe Solomon had a hand in the book of Job as we have it today. Perhaps not that he added the poetry and the drama so much, rather that he learned his poetry and drama and parables from Job, and then that he added the prologue and the epilogue and the introduction to Elihu's speeches, which are the prose sections of Job. But on the other hand, we see a great deal of similarity between Job and Solomon, and that's what we want to concentrate on at this point, particularly, for example, the wisdom chapters. So you have a wisdom chapter in Job 28, which is Job's witnessing to his friends about the gospel, showing them that no matter how diligent people are in science, studying nature like miners work with nature to get gold and silver and copper and iron and topaz and other precious jewels, that still they don't find real wisdom that way, and you don't find real wisdom anywhere in nature, whether it's in the birds in the air, or whether it's in the minerals in the ground, or whether it's in the weather. None of this will give you real wisdom. Then Job goes on to say that real wisdom is in the gospel fear of God. Well, see, Solomon takes that up then. He has a wisdom chapter also. He does a little different. His wisdom chapter personifies Christ. And in a sense, Job does that, but not as directly as Solomon does. And he says, Solomon says in his wisdom chapter that Christ was here before the world was, and he made the world and keeps it going as wisdom, you see. And of course, Solomon made a great deal of wisdom because he was the wisest natural man that God ever made. And then also we find this statement that we have in Job 28:28, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We find in Psalm 111:10, which could have been written by Solomon. We're not real sure who wrote Psalm 111:10. Then we find it again in Proverbs 1:7, and we're quite sure Solomon wrote that. And then we find it again in Proverbs 9:10, and we're quite confident Solomon wrote that too. So you see that connection between Solomon and Job. When, for instance, Job develops the law of equalization, and we'll take that up in the 7th lesson. Briefly, we'll just say the law of equalization means that when people die, they're all equal. In other words, if they're rich or poor, they still die the same. If they're righteous or wicked, they still die the same. That's what we mean by the law of equalization. We'll take it up later. But then Solomon builds on that in the book of Ecclesiastes. And the whole book of Ecclesiastes, of course, is a conflict between the skeptic Solomon and the teacher Solomon, between the I and the he. The I is skeptic of everything, and it's just as skeptic as Job was here, builds on Job's skepticism, and says everything is vanity. When we have 12 chapters in the book of Ecclesiastes, and in those 12 chapters, we've got 36 references to vanity directly and 12 synonyms for vanity. That's quite a bit in 12 chapters. And it's all based on that law of equalization that Job developed in dialoguing with his friends. Then, too, there are many other similarities that I'd like to point out to you. Similar words and phrases, for example. The word for soul, nephesh, is found both in Job 3:20 and then in Proverbs 31:6. The word for a house of clay being crushed, which is daka in the Hebrew, D-A-K-A. It's found in Job 5:4, 6:9, Job 22:9, Job 34:25, and then it's found in Proverbs 22:22, where the poor are crushed in the gate. In Job 5:17, Eliphaz, one of the friends, speaks of 6 troubles. In Proverbs 6:16, we read of 6 things the Lord hates. Proverbs 30:15, 18, and 21, the numbers are 3 and 4 rather than 6 and 7. In Ecclesiastes 11:8, the numbers are 7 and 8, but we have numbers, you see, in Solomon, somewhat in a poetic, idealistic way, just like we do in Job. In Job 6:3 we have the word for sand, which is C-H-O-L in the Hebrew. In Proverbs 27:3 we read that sand is weighty, but a fool's wrath is heavier. In Job 15:7, Eliphaz asked whether Job was born before the hills, implying the existence of something previous to the hills. In Proverbs 8:24, in the wisdom chapter of Solomon, he says that wisdom was brought forth when there were no fountains abounding with water, indicating that Solomon there is clearly referring to Christ, who then as God existed before the foundation of the world. In Job 27:12 we have the word for vanity, which in the Hebrew is H-E-B-E-L, Hebel, and some translate it as foolish notions. But in Ecclesiastes it's the word for vanity, which is found 32 times or more, and 18 more times are synonyms for vanity. And that's in 12 chapters in the book of Ecclesiastes. In Job 31:6, Job is defending his righteousness and says he has always given just balances. In Proverbs 11:1, we read of false balances, and in Proverbs 20:23, we read of just balances. So you see the same words are used. In Job 31:9, as Job defends his righteousness, he insists his heart has not been seduced by a woman. Proverbs says much about adulteresses in many chapters, including Proverbs 4:3 and Proverbs 7:7. This again would indicate a connection that we see here between Job and Solomon. There are many such connections. We have a fine distinction, for example, both in Job and in Solomon, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, of wisdom. The top word for wisdom in both Job and in Solomon's writings is chokmah, which is C-H-O-K-M-A-H, chokmah. It's a word that covers everything in wisdom. It's the top word for wisdom. Then under that, the next word is segel, S-E-G-E-L. No, I'm sorry, it's bean, B-E-Y-N, like our bean. Sometimes we call our head a bean, you know. It means perception. And the next word under that is segel, S-E-G-E-L, which is prudence, a balanced mind. And the next word under that is data, just like the data we get out in nature today that we boast of so much in science. You know, we study the data in nature to learn something. And we find that in both books. What's interesting is, in those four passages where it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and I think Solomon's connected with all four statements. In three passages it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of chokmah, of wisdom. And there are always people today, even in our creation movement, who think we should separate Bible wisdom from nature wisdom, who believe that science as we know it today is not in the Bible. The Bible doesn't mention it, doesn't really know about it. It only speaks of spiritual things they think in their mind. And they always like to use that slogan I've heard so often in my 27 years in creationism: the Bible is not a book of science. But you see, even though it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, see, they don't think that wisdom refers to science. Even though it says that three times, yet the fourth time, in Proverbs 1:7, it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of data. And it's the same gospel fear of God. So you see, there's no way of escaping the gospel in science. Not if you want real good science. You want to get the most out of science. And that's an interesting thought as we compare Solomon and Job and the wisdom literature in the Bible. In Job 27:12, we have a word for steering, guidance, and management. Tekabelu, T-E-C-H-E-B-E-L-U, tekabelu. This first means a sailor. Then it is used for a rope used by the sailor for guiding or steering. Sometimes this word is translated as counsels, Proverbs 1:5, and Proverbs 11:14. Proverbs 20:18, it stands for good advice. And in Proverbs 24:6, it stands for wise counsel. In Proverbs 12:3, it means counsels of the wicked. All of this indicates that the same word is used in Job and in Proverbs, and that there is a close connection between Job's and Proverbs and between Job and Solomon. Then another unusual word found in both Job and in the Songs of Solomon is scent, scent of water, S-C-E-N-T. The Hebrew word is M-A-R-I-Y or J-A-C-H. In Job 14:9, just a scent of water causes the roots of a tree to sprout. But a person, when he's dead, he can't become alive again. We find this word used in songs, 1:12, 2:13, 7:14, for scent, connected with perfume. But again, it shows the same words are used by both Job and Solomon. Then the word for doctrine in Job 11:4 is L-A-G-A-C-H. It's used by Sophar, who challenges Job when Job claims that his doctrine is pure. The same word for doctrine is found in Proverbs 1:5, Proverbs 9:9, and Proverbs 16:21. You see, what this means for us is that we need a new picture of science. As we relate Solomon and Job, we see that they form the wisdom literature of the Bible. The wisdom literature of the Bible consists of Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Songs. And obviously, this is the best science, especially when you come to the philosophy of science, that we have in the Bible. And this shows that you need the gospel in the study of nature. You can't really separate the gospel and the spiritual things from the study of nature. And that's probably the greatest lesson that we can learn. So therefore, when it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, in these four passages, it clearly refers to what we call science today. You can't separate it from what we call science, from the study of the data in nature. And I think that's one of the powerful lessons we need to learn. What we find if we don't follow this, if we separate, as even some creationists do, and talk about a neutral nature or a neutral philosophy of nature, then you automatically get into idolatry and paganism. You automatically then don't serve God with all your heart, soul, and mind, but you sort of make something that God created God. And of course, that's the beginning of all unrighteousness and all problems. And so that's the reason it's important to realize that Solomon and Job are together, and that the wisdom literature is identical in the Old Testament and gives us some real lessons for the philosophy of science today. In the fifth lesson that we want to study in the book of Job, we're talking about the source of revelation. It's a problem because did they have written material in those days? What makes it a problem is that we don't find anything missing in the book of Job. All the theology that you have in the rest of the Bible, one way or the other, is found in the book of Job. All the laws that Moses spoke of, not of course as much in detail, but in general are referred to in the book of Job. Especially as Job describes his righteousness, he shows that he knows these laws quite well. And even the friends knew the law, and Elihu knew the law quite well that Moses describes many, many hundreds of years later. And then you have so much science in the book of Job. Where did they get all that information? Out of nature. The diligent way in which the miners, for example, did their mining is real significant and shows how much they knew in those days, much more than we would think. So we continue to ask the question, where did they get all this material? Well, when we study the book of Job, we find a few things mentioned. For example, visions are mentioned. Eliphaz has a vision in chapter 4. Elihu has a vision in chapter 33. Now, the visions are quite different. The vision of Eliphaz is one where there is fear, where there's a shadowy image, where there are cryptic messages, where hair stands on end, and no reference to the gospel at all, only work righteousness. So you know that isn't of the Lord. That has to be a seance. But the vision of Elihu is different. It's beautiful, it's quiet, it's no fear, it speaks of the gospel. In fact, it's the vision that leads into the heart of the book of Job when Elihu speaks of the angel above 1,000 that would ransom his soul from a pit. So that's one source. Then Bildad in chapter 8 mentions the ancients, the fathers that handed things down. And so does Job in chapter 12. Job also speaks of bards that come around and give messages as they go from place to place singing their songs. And then we have God talking directly, especially as he talked in the whirlwind talk. Job is complaining in the dialogue constantly God isn't talking to him anymore. And he wants a legal confrontation with God. So it appears as he was used to talking to God. Now our concern is, how about written material? We believe in the biblical doctrine of perfection, that God made a perfect world at the beginning, and that when Adam and Eve took of the forbidden fruit, that ruined that perfect world, and now God wants us still to have perfection. In Deuteronomy 18, he says that we have to be as perfect as he is, and again in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:48. This is impossible for us, impossible for anything in nature. Nothing in nature is perfect anymore. It's all cursed by human evil. God has done the greatest miracle of all to make it possible again in sending Jesus into the world, who in Job is called a pardoner, an advocate, a savior, a redeemer, a messenger above 1,000. This Jesus is substituted for us, and in him we can be perfect. But you see, God never leaves us in the lurch totally. There's nothing in us or in nature that's perfect. Nothing in science or in the university that's perfect. This is why science can never prove anything. The best it can ever do is disprove. But we do have something perfect in the Bible, in the written Bible. See, an oral transmission can never assure us that it's perfect, because you can't check it. But a written Bible you can check, and the written Bible has been checked over and over again. I've spent 27 years now, in the last 27 years in my work, in checking the accuracy of the Bible from a scientific viewpoint, from what we learn in science from nature. And it checks out all the time. In fact, it leads us to a deeper understanding of how to use nature and have better science. So I would like to see a written source also that they had. Now there's a theory that's developed by P.G. Wiseman, an archaeologist of the 30s, that suggests that Moses used 11 tablets as source material for Genesis 1 to 37. It's based on the concept that back in 2000 BC or 4,000 years ago in Babylonia, they had all kinds of tablets. Usually they were deeds or something that had to do with the court or legal significance. And usually at the end of the tablet it said this was the Toledoth, or the generation of the author of the tablet. And then he'd put his signature on, usually maybe with a signature ring, because they couldn't always write their name. Now that word is used in Genesis 1 to 37 11 times, and it appears to most commentators that it's a title word rather than a signature word, because the rest of the Bible has it as a title word. Numbers 3, Ruth 4, a number of times in the in 1 Chronicles 1 to 9, Matthew 1. So you know, the best rule for studying the Bible is let the Bible interpret itself. And so it appears that we ought to make this a title word. But Wiseman thought, let me try making this a signature word, and maybe this will reveal the authors of written tablets. And that's worked out quite well. We can find that almost in every case, everything that's written in the tablet happened in the lifetime of the supposed author of the tablet. And we can even find page numbers between the different tablets. So it appears quite clear to me at this point that Moses used these 11 tablets as source material. But now you see, Moses wrote much later than Job. Not all the tablets were done by Job's time, if we're talking about tablets now. But some of them were. God's tablet, chapter 1 to 2:4a in Genesis would be done. Adam's tablet from chapter 2:4b to 5:1a in Genesis would be done. Noah's tablet from chapter 5:1b to 6:9a would be done. Shem, Ham, and Japheth's tablet that gives us the flood story would be done up to chapter 10:1a. And then even Shem's tablet might be done going down to 11, about 12. The rest of them wouldn't be. Terah's tablet I don't think would be done yet, and surely Ishmael's and Isaac's and Esau's and Jacob's tablets wouldn't be completed by this time yet. Now the question is, are there references to something like that in the book of Job? Not directly. No direct reference. Writing is mentioned 3 times in connection with the confession of faith. I know my Redeemer lives in 19, again in 31, again in 16. But mostly writing is mentioned in connection with legal work, except when Job makes his confession, he'd like to have it inscribed on a stone with lead poured in, and so everybody would remember it. But there are indirect references to the tablets in Job. For example, in Job 24:24, where Job is trying to show that the wicked do not suffer over against the friends, he says they die easy, and he uses a real odd word. It's not a normal Hebrew word, edino. It means they go away easy. What's interesting is when you study Noah's tablet, and he tells us how Enoch didn't die but was taken, he uses exactly the same word with the same irregularity. See, that would make us believe that Job must have known that tablet to get that same word with that same irregularity that you have already in Noah's tablet back in Genesis 5:24. In Job 36, Elihu speaks about a mist. He's describing the weather and the power of God in the weather, and he speaks about a mist. The word is od, along O-O-D. And that same word is used when it says in Adam's tablet there was a mist that came up from the ground and watered the earth, and there was no rain yet in Genesis 2, describing the Garden of Eden before sin. And that's rather significant. And it's kind of an odd word too, and it would make us think that maybe Elihu knew of the tablet when he used that word. The flood is mentioned clearly in chapter 12:16 by Eliphaz. It's clearly mentioned, and it, of course, was known. It could be known even if there weren't any tablets, because it was a worldwide thing that happened all over the world, and all the legends of the world have some kind of a legend about a flood. So it's not surprising that the flood is directly mentioned in the book of Job. So we tend to feel that we can find as many as 20 to 25 indirect references to the tablets in Job, even though there are no direct references. And it is a puzzle as to why there are no direct references. You think they'd mention them, but they don't seem to. At least those are what we call the sources of revelation then in Job, where they found their material. And it shows that people weren't primitive in those days. They were just as advanced as we are today. Maybe they didn't have quite everything that we have today, but they certainly were advanced, and they certainly had plenty. And we don't want to consider them as primitive. Maybe as far as intelligence is concerned, maybe even quite a bit more intelligent than we are today. And that's a picture we should get, and then recognize that they needed a written Bible just as much as we need a written Bible, and probably did have it, as I've outlined to you. The sixth lesson that we're studying today in Job, we are still in the introductory lessons, and today we want to speak of the grace perspective in Job. That shows the emphasis on love in Job. The first way that we can understand this is to connect it with the outline. We have already demonstrated in the outline that the heart of the outline is the statement of Elihu to Job about an angel above 1,000 that would ransom his soul from a pit, and that would make his flesh as fresh as a little child again, showing the power of love. Job knew this quite well, even before he finally repented, and the Lord led him deeper into it by having him pray for his friends and sacrifice for his friends. He makes it quite clear in the 31st chapter that he could have been a world power very easily. He was very brilliant, very capable, a ruler, and he could have been like Genghis Khan or like Nebuchadnezzar or somebody like that, or like David. But he wanted to not to use force. These world powers all have to kill people and have wars and have to use force. And of course, the government has to use force anyway because the people are so wicked. But he didn't want to do that, so he sort of renounced the possibility of being a world power because he wanted to show the value of love and the power of love. And in that respect, even before Job repented, and even before Elihu brought him deeper into the love of God, you could see that he knew the love of God quite well. And this is why God said he was Tom, or perfect, why he feared God, why he refrained from evil, as God spoke to the devil and described him to Satan. Job demonstrated that the greatest love, then, is not the love we have toward one another, although that certainly is part of righteousness, but the greatest love is the love that we have toward God. And this is what he really specialized in, was love to God. This is why, for example, when his children had their birthday feasts, he would sacrifice for them and pray for them the next day after the birthday feast, and see to it they were involved, so that they wouldn't get away from God, so that they would learn with him to put God first, and not through their enjoyment, which wasn't wrong in itself, get somewhat away from God. And of course, when he had his dialogue with his friends, he accused God of unfairness, but he'd always come to God. He said to the friends, you're not helping me, and I don't have much to do with you. My problem is with God. And this demonstrated his personal faith and his love to God. And of course, in the 31st chapter, he shows the great love that he did demonstrate before he had these calamities, namely how he helped the fatherless and the poor, and those who were orphans and needed help, the widows. He was always ready to help them. He was known for his love. And of course, I'm sure everybody who worked with him and for him appreciated this great love that he showed. Yet, and then of course he knew the gospel of love, and that's what he based it on. He knew the pardoner and the advocate and the savior and the redeemer. And he realized that his friends didn't know this greatest of all love, the love of Christ. And he tried to witness to them, to bring them to this love. And eventually God did bring them to this love when Job sacrificed for them at God's command. But still at that, Job didn't know this love deep enough. All of God's attributes are limitless. His power is limitless. His presence is limitless. His wisdom is limitless. And so is his love. His love is limitless. And we need to go into it more fully. We need to know that there's more power. This is what Job needed. He was accusing God of injustice because he didn't know the limitlessness of the love of God. And therefore Elihu did that great thing and led Job deeper into the love of God in Job 33, 23 to 25, and said that there was an angel above 1,000 who would ransom his soul from a pit, and who would make his flesh as a little child's again. And this, of course, literally happened. And then Elihu showed this love by censuring Job in the utmost of love, treating Job as if he was a king upon the throne, although Job was a despised person on a dung heap at this time, physically. And this influenced Job, and Job listened. He didn't argue with Elihu. He felt that love, and he appreciated the love that Elihu showed. Friends didn't show that kind of love. They could only censure Job. That's why Job called them miserable comforters. And then, again, we find that love in the two whirlwind talks. Now, the two whirlwind talks were, of course, primarily law in a way, rather than love, because they were to show Job how wicked he was and how much he needed repentance. But on the other hand, you see a lot of God's love in the two whirlwind talks too, how he takes care of everything in nature, how he produces the foundations of the earth, how he produces the weather and how he directs the weather, how he produces the stars and directs the stars. That's all God's providence and his love. Also, the way he takes care of the wild animals. Job had a lot of love, but he really didn't care too much about the wild animals. Yet God fully takes care of them, showing the greater love of God. And it was this love, of course, that finally changed Job. Then he recognized his sins and repented in dust and ashes. And then God again led him deeper into that love when he made him sacrifice and pray for his friends. And then God gave him double of everything he had. Thus you see the power of love. Love here turned, well, of course, made Job great to begin with. And because he got away from the love, he had problems. As he got back to the love and deeper into it, then he had solutions for his problems. And then he had tremendous, miraculous blessings, even physically. His flesh, which was full of cancerous boils and was dark, and the bones were sticking out and very painful and contagious, leprous and cancerous, and he had to live on a dung heap outside the village. That all changed dramatically by the power of love, so that he lived another 140 years, had all his friends with him, and had more power and prestige and glory than ever. And then also that love brought his friends around, and that love gave him double of all the blessings he had before. And all of this illustrates the great power of this love. One of the problems throughout life is for Christians to know and use the power of this love, because the world doesn't. The world plans on force. And that's what we see in the Marxist countries today, where they depend on force. One man told me already back in 1972 that in Eastern Europe alone, they had killed 60 million people in 60 years. And yet he admitted they hadn't really accomplished very much by doing that. We see this also among many other philosophies today. The evolutionary philosophy is primarily one of force. It says that progress was made by whoever can hit someone on the head the quickest. That's the way you make progress. So they really depend on force for their basic philosophy. They don't really know what love is, essentially. And so you see, this has to be a miracle. It was a miracle with Job to begin with. It was a miracle for Job to be led deeper in the gospel. It was a miracle for the friends to be changed by that gospel finally when he prayed for them and sacrificed for them. And so it's a miracle for us every day. You can see with Job that even though you have that miracle perfectly, as long as you're in this world, you're going to need it over and over and over again and go deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And that is probably the great lesson of the Bible in general. Like Paul says in Romans 8, if God's done the greater thing for us and gave his Son for us, surely he's going to do the lesser thing also. And God has done that in Christ. And now we see in a remarkably different way just how powerful this is in the book of Job. As we said before, the book of Job isn't always the best known book in the world. And particularly don't people realize how much of the gospel and love there is in the book of Job. I was teaching a Genesis and Science course for 3 weeks in the summer of 1986 in Glen Rose, Texas, and I had a couple students. And we finished up early on a Wednesday night, and we had a restaurant meeting at the end. And at that restaurant meeting, one of the students says, well, I don't think there's any gospel in the Old Testament. And I felt rather discouraged. I felt like I had failed as a teacher because that was the thing I was trying to bring out. And I pointed out to them how much gospel there is throughout the Old Testament, but particularly also in the book of Job. There really isn't any difference between the two testaments, finally, as far as doctrine is concerned. It's just that in the Old Testament things are more in picture form because some of these things hadn't developed yet that we have in the New Testament. All of it shows that God wants us primarily to be changed drastically so that, as we prefer to do by our flesh, we don't depend on force and on people, but rather that we depend on love and on the Lord and on the love that is pure love. See, the only way you can have pure love is through Christ, because otherwise the love is either selfish, not real love, or we're afraid of punishment. But when we have thankfulness for what Christ has done for us, what the Redeemer and the Messenger and the Advocate and the Partner have done for us, then we have real love. Then we have real thankfulness. And so we hope we can learn also from the book of Job the tremendous renewing power of love. We're now on the 7th lesson of the book of Job in the 52 lessons that we've outlined for this book. And we want to talk about something that you usually don't find in commentaries stated that way. It's called the law of equalization. It's something I've coined myself, and you might like to have a different expression for it, but I have to explain it anyway. What happens is that when the friends said that Job must have committed a special sin, and when they insisted that the righteous are always blessed in this life and the wicked are always punished in this life, because they were limiting themselves to this life, and when they insisted that Job could overcome his problems through his own efforts, then Job wanted to defeat them on their own ground. After all, they were having an argument with one another. And so since they were limiting themselves to this life, he was going to limit himself to this life too. And therefore he says in this life there is a law of equalization, that when the wicked die and the righteous die, they really die the same way. The wicked don't die really better than the righteous, and the righteous don't really die better than the wicked. Same way when the rich and the poor die, they die the same way. They're still buried and to die. The rich might be, they might be buried in much more glamour with much more wealth, but they're still dead, and they're really equalized in death. That was his point. And he was doing this to refute his friends. Now, when you first approach this statement of Job, it makes you puzzle. Here was a man who was maybe the greatest Christian ever outside of Christ himself, whom God bragged as being perfect and fearing God and refraining from evil. And yet Job here claims that everything stops with death, and that death equalized everything. Now, he knew better, otherwise he wouldn't have said, I know my Redeemer lives, and though my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God, and mine eyes shall behold and not another. But you see, he was arguing with his friends. He was making a point with them. You're going to restrict yourself to this life. I can do the same and totally refute you, because that isn't the way it happens in life, that the wicked are always punished in this life and the righteous are always blessed. That just isn't the way it happens. And he made a big issue of it later on in the 21st and 24th chapter to show how much the wicked were blessed. Those who were adulterers and murderers and thieves and oppressors, they were blessed. They could see their children till the end. Their children played. They had a good time. They had wealth. They didn't care about God. They were clearly wicked, and yet they were blessed. So he claimed that isn't the way it happened in this life. Then, of course, he went on further and said that God isn't fair, that God is destroying Job unnecessarily. Job shouldn't have to suffer that way. It isn't right that the wicked always are blessed, as he said it, and that the righteous are always punished, seemingly. But even though he did something wrong, obviously, with this law of equalization, yet there was some value in it. It takes a while to see that value, but it's there. First, number one, of course, it's true that in this life the wicked aren't always punished and the righteous aren't always blessed. It is true that in this life there is an equalization, so to speak, at death. So in that way he did defeat his friends. Then there's another value to it, and that is it demonstrates, as Ecclesiastes brings out, which is based very much on this law of equalization, that the dead know nothing. There's no contact with the dead and the living. I remember a Ben Alexander that came to me once who had been a seancer, and of course he got converted, and he was a Christian, and he was lecturing largely to try to get the teaching of witchcraft out of our schools. That's so dominant in our schools today. They won't allow creation, but they teach witchcraft all over the place. This man felt yet, at the time I talked to him, although he had become a Christian and he no longer materialized the forces of evil, yet he felt that there was some possibility of contacting the dead. And he brought up with me the story of Saul and Samuel. Samuel, was dead, and Saul talked to him, and Samuel seemed to talk to him and said tomorrow he'd be with him. He says, well, doesn't that show that there is some contact between the dead and the living? I said, so, but look at that story. Samuel said Saul will be with him, and Samuel was in heaven, and if Saul killed himself, he automatically wouldn't go to heaven. He'd automatically go to the other place. And I said that had to be the devil talking, assuming the shape of Samuel. And so it's still true what, first of all, Job points out in his law of equalization that death is it, and there's no contact in this life anymore between death and the living, although he knew full well there was a life after death. And this is what Ecclesiastes brings out then. And then again, in the book of Ecclesiastes, the refrain is vanity. You have that word Hebel, which is the Hebrew word for vanity, 32 times, plus about 18 synonyms, and in only 12 chapters. And that vanity, this skeptic side of Solomon that finds everything wrong in life, is really based much on what Job said when he developed his law of equalization. If we have the Stoics and we have the cynics who say, well, what's the use of doing anything in this life? Everything always turns out wrong anyway. Our flesh often feels that way. And this is really what is all behind this law of equalization. It's a skeptic, cynical approach to life, not really a very Christian one, but it did defeat the friends in their arguments, and that's all Job was interested in. Job showed that he knew better later on when in the 27th chapter he was witnessing his friend. Then he showed how the wicked are punished, and particularly the kind of wickedness they were doing, hypocritical righteousness, which was really wickedness. Now, what Job really was doing then was abusing a good law. There isn't anything wrong with the law of equalization as such. It's there. It's true that at death the wicked and the righteous are equalized, and the rich and the poor are equalized, and the intelligent and the ignorant are equalized at death. And of course Ecclesiastes says that over and over again. But you see, this is a law that can be abused, and Job was abusing it, especially when he used it then to say God wasn't fair. See, that's when he was abusing it. Now, we have many laws in science that way today that are being abused. There are all kinds of laws in nature that our scientists have worked out. It's laws of chance, laws of time, laws of the environment, but they abuse them because they try to use those laws to say that they produce things of themselves almost without God. They want to get rid of God and the moral standards that he sets up for them. They don't want to follow those moral standards. And so they claim, no, the chance developed everything, or the environment developed everything, or time developed everything. Now, these are great laws. There's great things in the laws of chance. We have a whole science developed to the laws of probability. There's great things in the laws of the environment, and there's great things in the laws of time. But they can't produce. And then when they claim they can, see, they're abusing them even more so than Job was abusing the law of equalization here in the book of Job. Environment can't produce anything. Things adapt to the environment, but you can't get the environment to produce anything if it's not already coded in whatever organism adapts to the environment. In other words, you can't get a bear to turn into a cow unless it's already coded to do something like that. The environment won't turn it into a cow. Yet it can adapt to the environment, all because it's been properly coded for that by the Lord. Same way with chance. We've proved it over and over again by the laws of probability. There's no way that hydrogen and water vapor, ammonia can come together in some primordial soup and by chance produce the first amino acids, and then by chance produce the first polymers, and then later on the proteins in the life cell. There's no way that can happen. It's way too complicated for that. And now, to say that it happened that way is abusing, again, the law of chance. And then to say that time can create is also abusing the law of time. Time is a great blessing. Probably the first thing that God ever made, a great order system in this world. Time, properly used, is worth more than silver and gold. But time is not God. It doesn't create. And when we give it creative powers, as our mega evolutionists do today, then that's abusing that law, just like Job was abusing the law of equalization here in the book of Job. And so we can see there are great laws that God gives us in nature. Job had one of those here in the law of equalization. Let's learn to use them properly. Let's not abuse them. Let's not give them powers they don't have. There's great blessings we get from them, but not if we abuse them. Then we don't get the really great blessings out of them. And that's one of the lessons we learn from this law, equalization.